Welcome to the Lymphoma Research Foundation's COVID-19 Vaccines, What the Lymphoma Community Needs to Know webinar. My name is Shalane, and I'll be the operator for today's call. During today's call, you will hear from an expert speaker, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions. If you have questions during the presentation, you can ask them at any time in the Q&A box on the webinar. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. At the end of the program, a link will appear on your screen. Please follow this link to complete an evaluation of this program and gain a certificate of attendance. If you are listening by phone, this link will be sent to your email at the end of the webinar. And now I'm pleased to introduce Jessie Brown. Jessie Brown is the Associate Director of Patient Education at the Lymphoma Research Foundation. Welcome, Jessie.
Thank you. And thank you to each of you for taking the time to join us on today's COVID-19 Vaccines, What the Lymphoma Community Needs to Know webinar. We'd like to thank our sponsors of this webinar, AstraZeneca, Genentech, and Pharmacyclics LLC, an AbbVie company, and Janssen Biotech, Inc. Before I turn the program over to our speakers, I want to briefly share information with you on the Lymphoma Research Foundation. Access to expert disease information is so important, and we're thrilled to be able to bring you this educational program today. The Lymphoma Research Foundation is the nation's largest nonprofit dedicated exclusively to lymphoma. Our mission is to eradicate this disease through investment in the most promising lymphoma research and to serve those impacted by lymphoma through quality education and support opportunities. As we continue to make progress in advancing lymphoma research, we also want to ensure that you have access to the latest information about your disease. The Foundation provides comprehensive disease and treatment-specific resources, programs, and services, all of which are offered free of charge and have been reviewed by lymphoma experts. In addition, we have launched our COVID-19 Learning Center to support lymphoma patients and caregivers through this challenging time. Please visit our Learning Center for access to webinars, articles, and other resources specific to COVID-19. If you have questions regarding what you heard about today, or if you need information about relevant treatment options and supportive care resources, you can reach out to the Lymphoma Research Foundation through our website at lymphoma.org or by calling our helpline at 1-800-500-9976. We have a wonderful program planned for you today, and I'm honored to introduce you to Dr. Brian Strom. Dr. Strom is the Chancellor of Biomedical and Health Sciences and the Executive Vice President for Health Affairs at Rutgers University. Dr. Strom is also a university professor and epidemiologist with a clinical research interest in pharmacoepidemiology. He is currently editor-in-chief of the Pharmacoepidemiology and Drug Safety Journal and a member of the American Epidemiology Society. He's also overseen the COVID-19 efforts at Rutgers as Chancellor of Biomedical and Health Sciences over the past year. We're so honored to have you here today, Dr. Strom, and I'll now turn the talk over to you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. What I'm going to be talking about today is, again, COVID-19 vaccines, what the lymphoma community needs to know. Firstly, what is COVID-19? SARS-CoV-2 is a strain of acute respiratory syndrome-related coronavirus. Coronaviruses are very common. This is one particular coronavirus named as it was in February 2020. WHO named the disease then COVID-19. This disease was identified in late 2019. It became epidemic by February 2020 and declared pandemic by WHO on March 11, 2020. All ages are susceptible to infection, mostly via aerosolized particles, as we now know, with a median age of infection of about 50. There are 405 therapeutic drugs in development. Some treatments have shown benefit. Outside of public health interventions, vaccination is anticipated to be the most effective strategy for prevention and control. On March, it has now become through 2020 in the U.S. The third leading cause of death. First leading cause of death is heart disease. Second is cancer, and COVID-19 is the third leading cause of death in the U.S. in 2020. So this has had a massive public health impact. If you look across the world, these are data now from April 12th, so very recent. The U.S. is no longer a red zone, but it is an orange zone as our COVID epidemic continues to increase, as I'll show you. If you look across the U.S., it varies by state. And right now, the Midwest and the Northeast are the places that are suffering the most as we speak. Again, this is as of April 12th. If you look across our state of New Jersey, every county is now red. So we are very much in the middle of a bad pandemic, although just in the last week, it looks like it may have changed. You look again as of April 12th, cumulative confirmed cases worldwide are 136 million. And I specify confirmed cases because these are the ones that we know about that have been documented by testing. Undoubtedly, there are 2 or 3 times that number undocumented. Cumulative cases in the U.S., 31 million, again, confirmed cases. Deaths in the U.S. now well exceed 500,000. Deaths, cases in New Jersey, confirmed cases exceed 800,000. New Jersey confirmed deaths now exceed 20,000. So there's more deaths in the state of New Jersey than in 1 year from this disease than in almost all of the wars in history that the U.S. participated in. Current hospitalizations are about 2,300, currently on ventilators in New Jersey, 240, intensive care unit, 441. Statewide positivity rate is 14%. This is as of last week, the data. Lag, as of yesterday, the data from last week looked like it dropped below 10%. Just to give you a sense of perspective, WHO gets worried when the positivity rate exceeds 5%, because it means the pandemic is spreading. So this is a disease, a pandemic, a stage of the pandemic, which is now still spreading. Last week's data, again, the rate of transmission was 0.96 for the first time in a good while, less than 1. What a rate of transmission of 1 means is for every case we have, we get 1 new case. Rate of transmission over 1, which is what it has been now for a few months, means the pandemic is spreading. Now within New Jersey, at least, it is just beginning to shrink. So nationwide, we have now a 4th surge, and you see that on the right-hand side of this curve. This is number of cases. The 4th surge you see, again, on the right-hand side. If you look specifically in New Jersey, we've had 3 surges, the one in the spring, the one over the winter, and then now the 4th surge on the right-hand side. And as you can see, it's beginning to turn down in terms of number of cases. Hospitalizations, you can see we had far more in the spring, again in the winter, and now again going up in the state's 3rd surge. If you look at New Jersey deaths, you see this dramatic increase over time. We are extraordinarily grateful to our healthcare workers who have been working, saving lives throughout all of this. This is a sign from the New Jersey Turnpike. Rutgers Health, thank you, our healthcare workers, from the bottom of our hearts. One of the things we did in Rutgers was form a new Center for COVID-19 Response. This center, headed by David Alond at New Jersey Medical School, now has already gathered over $30 million in extramural support, over 30 clinical trials, and it involves over 100 researchers in multiple disciplines. Rutgers is also the only COVID-19 prevention network site in New Jersey as part of the NIH Operation Warp Speed. Rutgers has been involved in clinical studies with 17 different public and private sponsors, vaccines, therapeutic, and diagnostic trials. We also have had a very large healthcare cohort study underway, a longitudinal study of 5,200 participants looking at the natural history of the disease. We collected over 27,000 biospecimens. We began this as the first pandemic began. New Jersey, keep in mind, was the epicenter of the world for the pandemic last spring. Multiple other studies underway, multiple COVID-19 related trials underway as well, looking at treatments ranging from hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, remdesivir, et cetera, convalescent plasma, and so on. Vaccine studies, we were sites for the Moderna study, for the Pfizer study, for the Sanofi study, and for the J&J trial. We were, in fact, the 2nd largest study site in the world for the J&J vaccine, the 3rd being Columbia, not Columbia University, but the country of Columbia. And phase 3 Moderna trial, in addition, was conducted in collaboration with University Hospital in Newark. C&J developed its own new COVID-19 vaccine strategy that our cancer center, a new method for delivery of medicines and vaccines directly to the lungs. New technology, patents have been filed, technology has been licensed to a biotech company, or possibly a new way to deliver treatment and vaccines to the lungs. Keep in mind the 4 key T's of battling COVID-19: targeting, testing, treating, and tracing. In terms of testing, our Rutgers developed high-throughput viral testing, maybe the largest in the U.S. for a single testing site. Began at 20,000 tests a day with 24-hour results. We're now doing 100,000 tests a day of saliva testing. We also developed the Cepheid point-of-care test with results available in 45 minutes. We have a new approach to look at variants. New Jersey Medical School, our COVID new center, COVID center, new rapid test to detect 3 of the rapidly testing variants of concern: the UK variant, South Africa variant, and Brazil variant, using the molecular beacon probes that were developed at NJMS. We've continued doing about 10,000 tests a day at Rutgers. You can see here, in the right-hand column, our positivity rate has steadily been far less than that of the state. We've been around 1%, where the state has been around 10% in terms of our positives. And looking at data from now 2 weeks ago, 10,000 tests, 101 positives, 1.02%. We just got the data back from last week. We're down below 0.5% now. Most of this are now variants. They're either the New York variant or the UK variant going forward. We've had a major effort underway in the students. We've had a lot of cases among students, and this is sort of a student health campaign. These have been in social media. This has been on sidewalks. This has been all over the place to try to get people to properly test, stay home, wear a mask, distance. We've also developed a free exposure notification app for Rutgers, and participate as well in the New Jersey app. We've had very aggressive contact tracing here, and this gives you a sense of the effectiveness of it. Early summer, our athletes returned. We had a epidemic in our football team, quickly pushed down. Our students returned for Labor Day, again an epidemic, quickly pushed down. Halloween caused another blip. Thanksgiving caused another blip. Christmas holidays caused another blip. Students returned for the second semester, caused another blip. You can see, again, each time pushed down. Now spring break, again a blip. And in the last week, that is back down again. Notice that the scale here, the state was at 10%. We never exceeded 3%, and most of the time we were much lower than that. But you do see this increase, this concerning increase over time until very recently, when we were successful in getting back to a better baseline, as was the state, below 10%, but now back above 10% again. Again, it looks like it is now in the last week, maybe turning back down again as we begin to recover from our third surge. Our hospitalizations are now up, which is what you'd expect. The hospitalizations lag 2 weeks behind cases. The deaths lag but 2 weeks behind that. So the cases are beginning to turn down. The hospitalizations and deaths are still going up. How do we return to normal? The key to that is herd immunity. Vaccine is key there. If you look on the right-hand side of the curve, with no herd immunity, this is a disease with an R0 of 5. That is, for every infected case, if placed into a general environment, they will generate 5 new cases. And so it very rapidly spreads. If you look on the right-hand side, once you achieve herd immunity, all those green people who are immune, that somebody gets sick, they can't pass it to other people because they're immune. And so one case leads to maybe one other case. And that's roughly where we are now in the state of New Jersey. How do we get there? You can get there by everybody getting infected. Clearly that will lead to much more illness and many more deaths. The better approach is their vaccination. Normal vaccination approach. On the left-hand side, you see preclinical testing followed by phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 efficacy trials, earlier limited approval, and then approval typically 73 months to completion. The amazing thing that we have gone through now over the last year with Operation Warp Speed is after 14 months, we have extraordinarily effective vaccines. The different types of vaccines are shown here: mRNA vaccines, adenovirus vaccines. Those are the two that are on the market now. Other kinds of vaccines that are in preparation as well. The leading vaccines now are the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, both mRNA vaccines requiring 2 doses. The J&J vaccine is an adenovirus vaccine that has been approved by EUA, though it got suspended today, and we can talk about that in questions if people have questions. 1-dose vaccine, major advantage in terms of 1 dose, and it doesn't have to be kept at very cold storage. Side effects, typical side effects are shown here, common but transient. And then severe side effects, allergic reactions have been reported to the mRNA vaccines. It's important to recognize that those allergic reactions are substantially less common than allergic reactions from penicillin. Though they occur, they're real, they're extremely uncommon, and certainly the risk from COVID is much higher than that. And let me just mention in that context, the J&J vaccine, again, the questions and the clotting problems, it's important to keep in mind, nothing is risk-free, including crossing the street and driving. But the risk here that we're seeing from the J&J vaccine, the new clotting data, is much less than the risk of dying from bicycle riding in the U.S., even further from the risk of dying from oral contraceptives, and close to the risk of dying from being hit by lightning in a year. So these risks are very, very low, and the risk from COVID is far higher. And so it's important to keep these risks in perspective. Herd immunity, obstacles, vaccination provides a pathway to immunity. Measles, you get herd immunity with 70%. We really don't know yet what is needed to achieve herd immunity from COVID-19. 70%, 80%, 90%, who knows? It's interesting that in New Jersey, we may be reaching the end of our surge. We've gotten to, or beginning the end of the surge, we've gotten to about 50% of the population getting at least 1 vaccine. Others, of course, had the disease. So our immunity is something a little bit above 50%. Concerns, vaccine hesitancy versus vaccine acceptance, questions about trust of the medical establishment and government agencies, safety concerns for side effects, both short and long term, and the systemic racism that has been faced by minority populations through the years, their underrepresentation in studies, and mistrust of research in general. Finally, the lack of infrastructure and politics that we've been through over the last few years lead to very and lengthy implementation period by federal, state, and local governments, and a suspicion of government in the process, which unfortunately is hurting us in getting to herd immunity as well. Opportunities and obstacles, mutants and variants you've heard about. They are a clear public health concern. Particularly those that have increased transmissibility and virulence. The spread of variants will continue as long as there's a lot of disease. Right now, the main variants of concern are the United Kingdom variant, the South African variant, and the Brazilian variant. The UK variant has basically taken over in the US. It is more contagious, which is why it is spreading. It may be a little bit more virulent. It, however, is sensitive to our existing vaccines. South African variant and the Brazil variant, we have less information about. South African, at least, looks like it is sensitive to at least to the AZ vaccine, the adenovirus vaccine, though that remains to be seen. There are at least 7 distinct variants circulating in the U.S. We've got more than that actually just at Rutgers, based on the testing we've done. The risk here is the variability in vaccine efficacy. Because of that, it is critically important that premature abandonment of public health interventions, that is testing, tracing, masking, social distancing, hand washing, would be a disaster right now. We still have to rely on public health interventions. The efficacy here in children isn't demonstrated. the question of safety in pregnant women, government mandates, employer mandates, all of that remains to be determined. We remain reliant on public health measures. Widespread, rapidly increasing vaccinations across the U.S. It is wonderful to see. We have great vaccines. No one ever imagined we would have vaccines that are this good this quickly. You're talking about 95% efficacy for the mRNA vaccines. It doesn't mean the disease doesn't occur, but it means against hospitalizations and death. Of the over 100,000 people exposed to these vaccines, all three of the U.S. marketed vaccines, the total number of deaths was 0. The total number of hospitalizations was 0. So we are seeing a little bit of disease escaping the vaccine, but it's very mild disease or completely asymptomatic disease. These vaccines have been extraordinarily effective. We need to use them as rapidly as we possibly can. The CDC most recent data from a couple of weeks ago showed that in the real world, they're also 90% effective against getting disease. Critically important because if they're effective against getting disease, even mild disease, 90% effective, that means people who are vaccinated are much less likely to pass the disease on to other people in addition. So not only does the vaccine protect you, but the vaccine protects the people around you as well, because even if you get asymptomatic disease or very mild disease, you're less likely to pass it on to anybody else. But public health interventions, again, keep in mind, remain the most effective way to prevent COVID-19 infections. As more of the public becomes vaccinated, premature abandonment of masking, physical distancing, and hand washing will prolong the pandemic. Even if 100% of the public receives vaccine, the first dose only provides 80% immunity, the second dose up to 95% immunity. That still means 5% of the population is vulnerable. So wear a face covering, watch your distance, wash your hands. We isolate now so that when we gather again, no one is missing. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Strom. I'm now honored to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Evans. Dr. Evans is a hematologist and oncologist and the director of the lymphoma program in the Division of Blood Disorders at Rutgers University. He also serves as the assistant director for clinical services at Rutgers Cancer Institute, as well as medical director for the oncology service line at RWJ Barnabas Health. Dr. Evans is also a professor of medicine at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He is also a member of LRF Scientific Advisory Board and has served as an expert speaker on many previous patient and professional education programs. Thank you so much for speaking at our program today, Dr. Evans. I'll now turn the talk over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the nice introduction. Thank you, Dr. Strom. I learned something every time I hear you speak. That's just fascinating background and context. And I'm obviously going to drill a little bit more into how this, really everything Dr. Strom mentioned, how it impacts cancer. And of course, moreover, what about lymphoma? And really drill down to even some drug-specific guidance. And so this is a quick outline that I'll go through in the next 20 minutes or so. And then, of course, we have some time for questions at the end. So when we talk about, and I usually don't like to talk about community-facing programs, mention the word death or lethality, but I think this is, frankly, the first time I'm ever going to do it in 20 years and probably thousands of talks, because it is so significant. And it's something that obviously is generational. And it's something that, as you're going to see in the next slide, that unfortunately is more prevalent, the lethality in cancer patients. And this has been studied, it's still new, and we don't want to overstate it at the same time. But at least data we have, even when we look under the hood of cancer, it's even a little more prevalent, the severity of COVID-19 infection in hematologic malignancy patients compared to others. So this is just a touch of some data, and I have some references at the bottom. This was off an editorial from Dr. Rebus. When the bigger the dot, the larger the study, and the more to the right of that dashed line means an increased risk in cancer patients versus no cancer patients for death or severity of COVID-19. And so it's not just one study. As you can see, it's an accumulation of studies where COVID-19 is serious in anybody, but that extra sensitivity and severity obviously is more prominent and worrisome in cancer patients. And so one quick next question might be, well, why is that? And it's early days. We're starting to get the data. This is a very heavy-duty publication, so I don't recommend it. It's not light reading, but it's fascinating reading. This is one of our most prestigious journals in the medical field, Science. And really, not surprisingly, it's drilling down to the immune system. And we don't know why, but certain patients' immune system reacts differently to this infection, as it does to anything. We all are a little different. But they were able to boil this down to 3 different groups. It's called an immunophenotype, meaning we have different types of our immune system. We have T cells that fight infection and cancer for that matter, but there are subsets to those T cells. And I won't go into details, but suffice it to say there's different groups where there's almost an over-response to the COVID virus. And those are some of the patients who have, frankly, a worse outcome to this. And then there's another group that has a more appropriate immune response with less severe, and then immunophenotype 3 that don't react at all, that have a very poor response. And that's where cancer patients can fall into. You know, and Dr. Strom alluded to this, and I want to really underscore this, is, you know, sometimes we think about the death rate and we hear, oh, it's 1%, no big deal, right? COVID at 1%. But here's the problem that worries me, at least as a cancer provider, is, and the term long-term is actually not the right term. It actually should be post-acute, as that paper, it's a really excellent paper that just got pre-published last month in Nature Medicine, another prominent journal. The so-called long syndrome or long COVID or long hauler, I think the best term is post-acute, because acute you could say with is in weeks or months. Long-term you think of many years down the road. Well, this hasn't been around many years. So I think the term post-acute, I worry about the long-term side effects. And you will be, I frankly was astonished at some of the prevalence of what we're already starting to see. And you could almost say it's not so much what organ is affected in this post-acute long-term, it's almost what organ's not affected. And it's startling, quite frankly. And these are including some patients who had so-called mild infection, who have lung damage, blood clots related to the COVID. So forget the 1 in 7 million vaccine, not to minimize that whatsoever. Reproductive headaches, severe fatigue, vertigo, brain dysfunction, PTSD, kidney, cardiac, etc. And obviously we need to know much more about this. We don't want to overstate it. We don't want to understate it. And thankfully there's a lot of research, including, as Dr. Strom alluded to, a lot of funded research at Rutgers, as well as across the country, that's ongoing. And so why this worries me is we already know there are quote unquote late effects in cancer survivors. You know, obviously that's our goal, cure cancer, do it with as minimum amount of toxicity acute as possible. But we know, unfortunately, due to very conventional chemotherapy radiation, our patients are at risk for many of those things in the second bullet. So I'm obviously hopeful that this isn't an additive or God forbid, synergistic effect. So when we think about the risk of vaccines, including the J&J data that emanated today, it's not to minimize it, it's to look at the risk-benefit ratio to a proportion of patients who don't get vaccinated at risk for all of this. And so I would submit for the vast majority of patients, obviously the benefits outweigh the risks in terms of COVID-19 vaccination. So let me pivot and talk a little bit more about general guidance. And so this is kind of big picture cancer guidance. And a lot of what I'm going to show you here comes from national guidelines of different expert groups, and I'll call those out as we go along. And so this was early guidance from several cancer societies, is generally speaking, we, the cancer community, or experts recommend vaccination, frankly, for all patients, in particular hematologic malignancies due to some of the data that I had alluded to before. And why? Well, not just due to the effect to the individual patient. Yes, that's number one. But number two, as Dr. Strom also had the great visual cartoon of this spreading and the numbers that we know cancer patients are in frequent contact with healthcare workers, et cetera. There is increased risk of exposure. We want to protect, obviously you want to protect yourself, you want to protect your family, we want to protect our society. So what about COVID vaccines? And I'm not going to drill really into the specific differences. I'm going to talk more in the big picture, just COVID-19 vaccination. Although most of the data will be probably more relevant to the mRNA, Pfizer, and Moderna vaccines. And so this is also something that's not maybe super well appreciated. You can say, well, if I already have the COVID infection, aren't I protected? Yes, you do build antibodies. But when you actually compare antibodies to someone who had COVID infection, protective antibodies, versus someone who had COVID vaccination, it's well more than 50 times the protection with a vaccination. And so that's part and parcel why we recommend for patients with a prior COVID infection, they still need to be vaccinated. Now, usually we'll say wait 3 to 6 months, but really when we say everyone needs vaccination, that's including if you had COVID-19 infection. Obviously, there are some individual cases and guidance we're giving, check with your local provider, oncologist, primary care for individual guidance and everything we're talking about. So let's look a little more in COVID-19 vaccination data within cancer. And the fact of the matter is there actually is not a huge amount. As you can see, 96% of subjects in this vaccine study did not have cancer, although some did, and 4% of 43,000 is something that's looked at, and there is obviously much more data that is accumulating over time. And we need to know this. We need to understand what is the immune response being generated to cancer patients, and that's not going to be a global one-size-fits-all answer, because cancer patients, everyone's different. Everyone is a different type of cancer. Even within lymphoma, as you know, there's 70 plus different subtypes of lymphoma, and then all different treatments. So we need to continue to study this. So again, I'm going to move to general vaccine guidance. And so NCCN is one such expert body. And so I'll give you kind of a few exclusions to some of the general vaccine immediately receiving it. So this is one. If your patient has received a stem cell transplant, we do hundreds of these a year at Rutgers. So in particular, an allogeneic as well as an autologous, your own cells, or if you've received a specialized cellular therapy called chimeric CAR T-cell receptor therapy that's mainly approved in lymphoma as well as in acute leukemia, we need to wait probably 3 months to let the immune system recover so you can generate an appropriate response to the vaccine. Maybe one other slight exclusion would be if you're receiving intensive chemotherapy. What do I mean by intensive? Especially for acute leukemia, there's some regimens that we take from acute leukemia, we use in lymphoma. You'd want to wait, sometimes the neutrophil counts from the chemotherapy can be down a few weeks until there is some recovery, at least over to a near normal level. After major surgery, they say really a few days. Again, these are more 50,000-foot recommendations, but I still think helpful. And really everyone else, regardless of treatment, should frankly receive the vaccine as soon as possible. I put this in a table format, and again, these are data within the last week or two and these obviously can change over time, but as of a week or two ago, these are the general guidance. I just put them into tabular form. There's a link there as well. If you'd like to look at this PDF, there's some other verbiage attached to this. So I'm going to talk about some of the different drugs here in a second. So what about drilling down to ASH or ASCO? ASH is American Society of Hematology, ASCO, American Society of Clinical Oncology. There's guidance. I would say it's mostly aligned, all of this guidance. Thankfully, it's not different here and there. You might see some different nuances that are helpful in one guidance. Obviously, there should be, what we're giving as general guidance. There needs to be individual adjudication, risk-benefit ratio in terms of when, which vaccine, not so much which, but more what time in your treatment course, et cetera, that you will receive it. So one other I should have mentioned as well, that it depends where you are in your treatment. So let's say you were just diagnosed with lymphoma and you're getting ready to start therapy, or you need a splenectomy, which sometimes we recommend in lymphoma and other diseases. Well, you want to give this a couple weeks beforehand, at least. I'll usually recommend 3 to 4 weeks. Why? You see that peak response 3 to 4 weeks after the first and as well as the second. And I'll talk to some more of this individualization as we move along. I already talked about the 3 to 6 months after receiving really maximum immunosuppressive therapy. Also, frankly, and I abide by this as well, not just my household, but patients' households, is recommend obviously to everyone, but especially the patient and their household. And let's not forget about influenza. Yes, this is a historically low influenza year, whereas if there's some silver lining to this mask wearing, it's a historically low morbidity, mortality to influenza this year, but that's still recommended. There still are patients suffering from influenza. Thankfully, that season is almost over. I should also mention, and I want to give LRF kudos. You know, if there's something that's happening in the lymphoma field, LRF, as you know, is often the tip of the spear and leading the way. So I was fortunate to be part of this panel, put together several weeks ago. Really was an expert panel, including, frankly, some of the first author New England Journal ID infectious disease experts on some of the vaccine studies were part and parcel to this committee. It was about 30 of us working our way through the data and putting out white paper recommendations for the lymphoma community. I don't think these are public yet, but these should be public pretty soon. And so, yeah, this was March 1st. Time flies. 6 weeks ago that we had this. But this should be released to the public, I would hope, in the next week or two. Additional guidance, I don't think anything drastically different than it's out there, a little more curtailed to the lymphoma community. So let's now dive into a few more lymphoma-specific considerations. So as we've said, if possible, and this is where you have that every patient is a snowflake individual situation, to recommend vaccination before starting therapy. Now, sometimes you don't have that luxury. You know, as you know, there are some lymphomas that are very aggressive. And, you know, I met a patient in clinic last Wednesday. It was life-threatening. We had to start treatment within days. Okay, we didn't have time there. We're going to have to figure it out along the way. But many lymphomas, I would even say, go as far to say the majority, you have a few weeks to spare, so to speak. And sometimes you're getting a PET scan, you're doing a bone marrow biopsy, getting your echocardiogram, et cetera, ahead of time. And that would be the frank recommendation. If you have that time to spare, obviously you don't want to compromise disease outcomes or anything like that, but that's one general recommendation. You might have some therapy specific. As everyone may know, there's some slightly more in the lymphoma world, immunosuppressive, meaning suppress your immune system, than others. Bendamustine is one. Another one is rituximab, although that's an antibody. We don't think of it as immunosuppressive. It's not as immunosuppressive as chemotherapy, but it's a monoclonal B-cell antibody, so it not only will block especially B-cell antibody production, it actually has some offshoot on T-cell function too, but not as much. And so you see a rituximab recommendation there in the bottom bullet that I put up here, as well as, if possible, to try to get the second vaccine dose in and wait 2 weeks after that, if possible, if the disease and situation would otherwise afford that. One issue is going to be, though, and I saw as a question in the chat already about serologic testing. There is a paucity of data in general, but especially cancer patients, of what about serologic testing to see if I have adequate protection to a COVID-19 vaccination in general in cancer patients, and even in rituximab. We have started a study at Rutgers to look at exactly this in cancer patients, and specifically rituximab, which, as you guys may know, rituximab is, by the way, not just given in lymphoma. Yes, it was first approved in November of 1997 for that, been around over 20 years, but this is given to a host of diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, other autoimmune conditions. So it is top of mind for many medical experts to understand what effect it has. Now, we can glean some data from the influenza world. It's not apples to apples, but when we look at that, at least some of the influenza data, and it's a little all over the place. I just parsed out one study listed here, is when we looked at what effect does rituximab have on efficacy, at least seropositivity from the influenza vaccine. This was one example where why we still recommend influenza is, yes, it looked to be less effective in this year of, I think it was 2018, or 2017 or 2018, 55% versus 79% for patients who had not received rituximab. And not surprisingly, it was somewhat linked to the interval of when someone had received that rituximab dosing. Well, let me just talk about a couple other drugs here. One that's used not just in lymphoma, but across many cancers, checkpoint inhibitors that have frankly revolutionized the care of cancer treatment. So as you may know, a checkpoint inhibitor in a simplistic way, how does that work? It basically stimulates the patient's own innate immune system, in particular T cells and other cells, to work better. That was, some of the folks who discovered this won the Nobel Prize, where they discovered about a decade ago that one of the reasons anybody develops cancer, there's many reasons, is that their own immune system does not work as well. And so why these were so revolutionary, it really took it away from just pounding with high-dose chemotherapy to literally have a medication that reinvigorates the patient's own immune system. One example, Jimmy Carter had metastatic melanoma in his brain over 5 years ago. Typical survival was weeks. He's still alive, thankfully, many years later from receiving a checkpoint inhibitor. And we know these are active. So there's some concern because I mentioned immune system several times in the last few sentences. So we always have some caution. Is there any negative interaction with COVID infection or vaccine? And so far, based on data, we need more, but based on data we can see is there is not a negative influence of COVID with respect to the COVID infection or vaccines. Now, obviously, there still needs to be more data, and we need to follow this more over time. So I've already worked through a few different considerations, and that's why lymphoma is, as you guys know, so interesting is the heterogeneity of it. When you have more than 70 different subtypes, they're all very treatable, but they not only have different treatments, but different natural histories. As you know, about 20 of those 70 lymphomas are so-called indolent lymphomas, slow growing. There are many patients who don't need treatment for years or a decade. Well, we have more flexibility and freedom to get the influenza vaccine, et cetera. But sometimes it can be an indolent lymphoma, but you need to start treatment soon. So obviously, how do we thread that COVID vaccine 19 needle with the specific lymphoma subtype and the treatment that's needed to treat? Or for the aggressive lymphomas, in those cases, it is curative therapy. So certainly we would not want to hold or really deviate from otherwise potential curative therapy, which most of the aggressive lymphomas, that is the goal, is to not just treat them into remission, but to cure them. Another, in the sub-bullet, as folks may know, there are different quote-unquote phases of therapy. So I'll give you an example. We'll say mantle cell lymphoma. That represents 6% of all lymphomas. There are 3 phases to treating mantle cell lymphoma. I met a patient last week, and so we talked about this. We said, okay, 3 phases. Phase number 1 is induction. Usually that's stronger treatment that they need to go into remission over 4 months. They go into remission, then the next phase often is called consolidation. In other words, finish the job. That often can mean current standard of care, an autologous stem cell transplant. Okay, you do that, great. And then what's after that? Maintenance rituximab. 1 dose every 2 to 3 months for 3 to 5 years. So obviously, depending where a patient is in that phase of therapy, would really have a ramification potentially on how and when we recommend the COVID-19 vaccine. So we recommend it in everyone, but obviously the timing of it is awfully individualized, as you can imagine. And of course, patient wishes, et cetera, are factored into the equation as well. It might come up, some questions have come up. Well, yes, how do we move the envelope? How have we made, and LRF has helped made lymphoma so treatable and curable? What's through clinical trials? And we still recommend it. Now, did clinical trials close a little? I mean, it's not close. Slow down. At some institutions, it did close. I'm going to give Rutgers a pat on the back, in particular, Dr. Hochster. And I'm confident for the rest of the Rutgers family and enterprise was in the same posture as we were. We slowed down a little, but I can tell you, we did not close one single cancer clinical trial. In fact, we opened a bunch of COVID clinical trials, but we did not close. A few slowed down, just due to the, especially early on in that first phase in April. But I'm really proud to the fact that, yeah, we slowed down a little, but it's so important, obviously, to make these advances. Now, you want to be cautious at the same time. It depends on the clinical trial. And I give this reference as to some general guidance if you, again, it was pre-published last month in this journal here as well. So where there might be maybe a little extra precaution would be in a so-called phase 1 study. So what is phase 1? Well, that's a study where there's maybe a little more experimental nature. You're trying to find the right dose. It might even be a first in human. So of course, we're going to be a little more, I'd say, cognizant or even cautious of a potential interaction to a new medication. These are usually medications, or it could be a device or surgical study as well in a clinical trial. So these are guidance you can see here is waiting a 2 to 4 week period. You can see, already in a phase 1, maybe wait until there's a certain time where safety has been established, et cetera. So phase 1 studies, there is some different calibration that I would say for phase 2 or phase 3 studies. But what I can tell you is, and I'm not going to show you a few of our studies that Rutgers had, and including some ones that were leading nationally, but for most studies, besides these phase 1 studies, so-called phase 2 studies or phase 3 studies, we really have calibrated all of the recommendations to allow COVID-19 vaccination in most instances. Now, there might be some timing issues like I talked about with neutrophil count, et cetera, but it is something that we are not closing cancer studies. And number one. Number two, we are still recommending vaccination if you are on a cancer clinical trial, which of course we still recommend strongly. Just a last couple nuggets here. Imaging, there's some interesting data and a little more data with the mRNA vaccine. So when you receive a vaccine, what happens? Your body, it's almost like simulating a COVID infection. You're not injecting COVID, it's the genetic code to COVID. So your body, it's almost tricking your body to create an immune response to COVID. And so not surprisingly, you get a sore throat, you have lymph nodes under your jaw. So that is what happens. And often if you get it in the arm, it tends to be a lymph node under the axilla, under your armpit. And so this came about with breast imaging mammograms, that they were seeing more lymph nodes pop up. So this is a recommendation, delay 4 to 6 weeks after COVID vaccination. Could have some connotation with our CT scans and PET scans that we like to get often in lymphoma. So it's one that I've had a few patients that, you saw a lymph node enlargement, and we didn't go down a road because they had just gotten a vaccination of doing a biopsy, et cetera. We followed it closely over time, and in all instances, it does not persist and goes away. So if you have some flexibility to maybe tweak it by a few weeks of when you get your scans, or at least have that data in the back of your mind. And this was a recommendation for breast cancer. I just want to finish with the second to last slide. And this has nothing to do with vaccines, but it was some really nice work that we published out of the Rutgers Cancer Institute. And this was a little more prevalent, top of mind, I should say, maybe about 6 months ago, or maybe it still is top of mind, is what's the risk from surfaces, environmental surfaces? There was a New England Journal laboratory study that showed a high risk, or at least persisting for 72 hours, these fomites to SARS-CoV-2. So it started with our radiation oncology department, and patients were afraid, understandably. Am I going to get risk for touching a doorknob, going to the hospital, touching something? And suffice it to say, we did 2 detailed studies, one in the radiation oncology space, as listed here. That's the bottom JAMA Oncology article. And you can see the different areas. We tested everything. And then we took it over and tested over 200 surfaces in the inpatient, outpatient hematology oncology units, as well as a COVID unit, doors, bathrooms, floors, computers, et cetera. In the radiation oncology, you see 0 of 128 surfaces tested positive for RNA, and 1 of 204. This doesn't mean it contained live virus, by the way, just RNA. Only 1 of 204, and that 1 was on the floor of a very sick COVID patient on a segregated COVID unit. Now, obviously, subtext to this is, as Dr. Strom showed you, the 1% rate. So we have pretty good cleaning and great environmental services, who we give them a lot of kudos for this, and everyone a little more cognizant with masks, et cetera. But suffice it to say, it is safe. You are not going to get this. This is a respiratory, obviously, virus, and the risk is minimal, if any, from surfaces at your medical center. So I'll just conclude and just recap quickly what I went through, that yes, unfortunately, the infection COVID-19 is more severe in cancer and likely lymphoma patients. COVID-19 vaccines provide significantly more neutralizing antibodies in a good way than actually post-infection of COVID. And general recommendation is the vast majority of patients to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, with obviously some critical individualized nuances depending on type of lymphoma, type of therapy, et cetera. And I gave you some study-specific guidance, the imaging, and the surface data. And then I'll just say thank you. This is our hematologic malignancies building at 195 Low Albany. There's some of that white stuff. This is from like 6 weeks ago. I should have taken a new picture because thankfully that has melted. And I'll say thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Evans and Dr. Strom. These were both really in-depth talks, and I know everyone was really excited to hear you speak today. So now we have some time just to begin our Q&A portion of the program. We'll take as many questions as possible, but if anyone has a question that does not get answered and you want further clarification, you can always reach out to the LRF helpline at 800-500-9976. Dr. Strom and Dr. Evans, I'm going to direct each question at one of you, but obviously if the other has anything additional to add, please feel free to do so. So the first question I'm going to direct at Dr. Strom. Someone asked, after a lymphoma patient has been fully vaccinated against COVID-19, should they subsequently obtain an antibody test to determine the degree to which the vaccine provided protection? Is that a useful tool for tracking effectiveness of vaccines?
I think the answer is no. What's striking is the clinical trials, as I alluded to before, 100,000 people vaccinated. They weren't uniquely in lymphoma patients, certainly. So we can't sort of give that as an absolute answer. But no one measured antibodies, and despite not measuring antibodies, there was 0 deaths and 0 hospitalizations in those people. And since then, the experience has been the same. It's been extraordinarily effective. I think the other thing to realize is antibodies are not the only part of the immune system. You've got a cell-mediated immunity as well. And so the immune system is complex. Antibodies is only half of it, and in fact, the longer-term immunity may be more likely to come from the cell-mediated immunity than the antibodies. So I know I've had a lot of questions, including from my daughter, who didn't have a reaction on her second dose. Very upset. Dad, does that mean should I get antibodies checked? Does that mean that I didn't get immunity? And the answer is no, because most people don't have reactions, and still overwhelmingly, again, 95% on average, 100% for hospitalizations and deaths. So there's no indication to measure antibodies as a way of testing whether or not the vaccine worked.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Strom. Dr. Evans, this question asks, could the immune response from a vaccine reactivate a lymphoma that is in remission?
I'll say the quick answer to that is no. With that said, we're always looking at this, understanding this. Frankly, you could even ask the opposite, is could the immune response treat the lymphoma? Now, that's a strong statement there, but the reason I say that is we have been, frankly, for 20 years, vaccines to treat lymphoma. And one of the main ways vaccines treat lymphoma is re-engineering and reactivating the immune system. So that's totally speculative, but I would say the quick answer is there is no data that it would adversely impact lymphoma. With all that said, like anything, we don't minimize any comment or data set or hypothesis, and obviously we need to keep studying this.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Evans. Dr. Strom, what does it mean to be an adenovirus vaccine for J&J? Also, can you talk more about what's happening with the J&J vaccine and FDA recent news?
Sure. So in terms of the second half first, there are 6 cases that have been reported in the roughly 6 million people who have received the vaccine of a rare clotting phenomena in people's brains. It's very rare. It's 1 in a million. It's less common than being hit by lightning in the U.S., but it's unusual. And so the question is whether it could be due to the vaccine. It is similar. If people remember, the vaccine development was paused. J&J vaccine development was paused during the development of the vaccine. It was for a similar side effect. And so this may well be due to the vaccine. And so FDA and CDC are being very careful by pausing the administration in the meantime in order to learn more about the vaccine, these cases, and learn more about what is happening. It is a careful movement. It's in order to protect the public. My sense, and I've spent my career studying drug and disease safety problems, is this may well be real, but it is still very, very, very uncommon. Much less common than COVID and bad side effects from COVID. Adenovirus is the way they get the COVID-19 spike, the protein, into the body. It's basically a respiratory virus. It's a largely benign virus that they use to carry it in to the body. And interestingly, AstraZeneca vaccine, which also has gotten into a similar trouble, also uses an adenovirus vector. So these are simply the mechanisms that the companies used to get the vaccine into people's bodies so that people would then develop immunity to it. I think you'll see over the course of the next week or two, they'll go into those cases in great detail, understand them in much better detail. And my prediction is that we're going to be real, but that's okay. People will be, they'll say, go back to using the vaccine because the risk-benefit of the vaccine is still overwhelmingly in favor of the benefit of the vaccine.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Evans, are there differences in effectiveness among different lymphoma subtypes and or depending how recently the person has had treatment for NHL? I know you touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're still trying to understand that. It really, and this is kind of a little bit big picture recommendation until we get more granular data, is it's thought to be how immunosuppressive the treatment is. So not so much a lymphoma subtype, but although the lymphoma subtype dictates primarily which treatment. And so not surprisingly, and again, this is kind of extrapolating from some of the influenza and other vaccine data that we've gathered over the years and decades, is that the more immunosuppressive, the lower the effectiveness. But what I'll say is I think in almost any condition, it's not going to be zero. And of course, you want to maximize your vaccine response to that. And so it really is following a lot of those recommendations that we have is kind of based on best available data, that if you're having a bone marrow transplant or CAR T-cell therapy, you may want to wait at least a few months to allow better recovery. But with all that said, too, there is just plain rituximab antibody. That's not by itself super immunosuppressive, but it might mitigate the efficacy. And so like anything, as we go and have these discussions at the individual patient level, it's a general recommendation to do it and to try to maximize the time in between, either before therapy, of course, at the end of therapy, or even in some cases during therapy. And the thinking during therapy is at least some protection is better than none, we could say. But obviously we need to keep following this over time. And I think, and we are doing it, and we will, I think, frankly, this year have a lot more data that'll be coming out to help guide us with more precision.
Great, thank you. Dr. Strom, I know you need to leave right at 1, so I wanted to get you one last question, which is, what does the future look like for lymphoma patients post-vaccine? Is it safe to see family again, or what can they expect?
I think once you're really post-vaccine, that is 2 weeks after the last dose, that is 2 weeks after a single dose vaccine or 2 weeks after the second dose of the mRNA vaccines, the 2-dose vaccines, you are very, very highly protected. And so, does it? Should you be with people who are sick? You probably shouldn't be, regardless, because of your underlying lymphoma. But from a COVID point of view, you're much more protected. And I would say it would be safe to start seeing family. Even better, obviously, if the family is also vaccinated, especially now that vaccine has gotten much more common, that is much easier to find. So the better vaccinated people are, the better. The more vaccinated people are, the better. But clearly, once you receive a vaccine, you're in much, much, much better shape to return to a closer to normal life. I wouldn't go into big groups where you don't know whether people are sick or not. But in terms of seeing family members, it's much safer after the vaccine.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Strom. Dr. Evans, we have a couple more final questions for you. This question asks, and it might be a similar answer from what you had said previously, but is the efficacy for the vaccine different for CLL patients? If so, what factors can affect the efficacy?
Yeah, it hasn't been shown that the actual lymphoma subtype is a critical determinant in that, although again, more data needed. It really, what drives part of it is the treatment on it. And when I say the treatment, I guess one caveat to that could be is, well, what treatment in the past did someone receive or have? And so if someone had received, let's say, 6 or 7 different treatments over the last 10 years, their immune system might not be as robust as someone. So not thought that the individual lymphoma subtype or CLL, or is it B-cell lymphoma, T-cell lymphoma, I think really the driving factor is the treatment. Of course, there are other factors like other comorbidities and things like that. Does someone have underlying lung disease and some things like that? But it really, a lot of the time in terms of the question boils down to the treatment, intensity, type, et cetera.
And are there other treatments where patients ought to defer vaccinations, specifically guidelines for stem cell transplant or CAR T-cell therapy?
The current guidance is yes to that. And again, it's not based on an abundance of data. In fact, it's a little more gestalt and kind of expert-based opinion. But I think a lot of it is, it's not guessing, of course. It's extrapolating from many, many years and decades of other vaccines and how we adjudicate those during it. But so, we certainly don't think it would cause harm during that. But at the same time, you don't want to give a vaccine if you think the effectiveness is extremely low. And so, post a bone marrow transplant, there takes not just a few weeks, but sometimes a couple months to have really good reconstitution of your immune system. So we want to make sure there is that effectiveness from that. So really the caveats are mainly that. Like we said, that one table I had shown from the NCCN, and there's others through ASH and ASCO. And as I alluded to, LRF will be putting out the white paper from this expert panel that happened last month. So I think besides that, and then maybe one other caveat would be just really immunosuppressive treatment. It's almost like what we would say acute leukemia-like. I'll mention one regimen. It's called hyper-CVAD. It's kind of like the real strong chemo. We fortunately don't use that a lot for lymphomas. I would say lymphomas, we use it. It's a rare one. We use those in Burkitt lymphoma, et cetera. And so that's where the neutrophil count goes down. But then after days or a few weeks, it comes back up. So you can kind of see that in the blood testing. And so maybe there are some needles you can thread of timing of when to receive the vaccine during such therapy. In other words, when the immune system is coming up. You can see it in the blood test.
Great, thank you. Someone asked if there are any precautions in particular people need to take between vaccine doses that have 2 doses, like by Pfizer and Moderna.
Yeah, it's a lot of the common sense precautions that Dr. Strom eloquently went through. So it's ones that, are you pretty well protected after one vaccine? And we're talking about the mRNA vaccines, which are 2 vaccines, either 3 or 4 weeks apart, Pfizer or Moderna. And so it's ones that you garner somewhere around, and these are rough estimates, 70-80% protection after 2 to 3 weeks after the first vaccine, and you're up into the mid-90s after the second. So you can still develop COVID in between the first and second vaccine. It's not 100% effective at developing it. So I think the quick answer would be yes, precautions should be maintained. But frankly, I would even go a step further. Even after the second vaccine, it's not like we can go maskless and kind of run around the neighborhood. Can there be obviously a little more freedom, of course, in terms of with family and smart, careful groups, et cetera. So even after the second vaccine. But, the other point I'll make here is, we were practicing social distancing before COVID, as many people know. This is a lot of common sense, kind of minimizing, especially the patient, their family members around them, from getting an infection, because you do not want to get an infection when your immune system is low, and it'll just be more severe on that point. So I think for the time being, even after both vaccines, but including between the first and second, it is still 6 feet, wearing masks, and just a lot of common sense precautions.
Great. We have our last question here. Is there any situation where a second sequence of vaccines would be appropriate? Maybe if it didn't work the first time, this person mentioned.
Yeah, no, that is a real area of research. There's also something called a heterologous vaccination. So some people have hypothesized, and this is not recommended, this is for future, are they slightly different? And should I get one vaccine at one time and switch it to another? So there's some real interesting science to back that up, but it needs to be studied, of course. And so the quick answer for that one is we don't know yet. And so, what we do know is, I'll say what we do know, is some of the data that just came out a week or two ago it looks like off of the backs of many of the big vaccine studies that were published in our big journal 6 months ago, it looks like at least at the 6-month mark, the vast majority of patients still have strong antibody protection. And so obviously we need to see how that goes. How is it going to be at 9 months, 12 months? Are we going to all need to be revaccinated? Is it going to be a different vaccine? I think right now we do not know that. Maybe these will go on for a few years. Maybe it'll be every few year adjudication as we go along. But I think this will be a big year on data. And so, in the lymphoma world, I know LRF is just a huge proponent of research in lymphoma, but obviously this impacts our lymphoma, it impacts all of us. And so, hopefully we'll be able to find funding for these important research studies, because there's not an absence of ideas. We have a lot of ideas. And so we just need to identify the funding, frankly, to be able to do these important studies to see how does it impact lymphoma based off of all the great questions we've had here today, and how can we continue to concurrently just keep pushing the envelope as we've done for years and decades of better treatments, better outcomes for lymphoma patients, while at the same time just mitigating all these issues related to COVID.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. And I think that's a great point to end on. And once again, thank you both for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this topic. It's so appreciated. And we know everyone on the call really appreciated you taking your time out of your day to talk to us about this. So without further ado, thank you to everyone on the call for joining us today. And we hope you found the information both informative and also hopeful. We'd also like to thank our sponsors again for making this program possible: AstraZeneca, Genentech, and Pharmacyclics, an AbbVie company, and Janssen Biotech. Please remember, if you have any additional questions or you'd like to be connected with someone else who's been impacted by lymphoma, you can reach out to the LRF helpline at 800-500-9976. Also, at the conclusion of this program, you'll receive an email prompting you to complete a program evaluation. At SAU, please take a few moments to complete this, as they're very important for helping us to ensure we deliver the most useful and meaningful programming to you. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day.